Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here this morning, and I intend to say a few words to begin with and then very much open to questions. So this is my first press conference as First Minister here in Bute House, and it comes, of course, following the successful passage of the budget yesterday, something that just a few short months ago a fair few considered to be improbable, if not impossible. This is my first budget as First Minister, and I regard it as an important milestone in the progress of the government. Not only does Scotland have a new First Minister providing the leadership to address the issues that matter to the public, but we also have the resources agreed to tackle the issues that matter to the public, above all, to renew and to strengthen our National Health Service, to deliver on the commitments that we have made to the public in Scotland. My approach to this budget was clear. First, it must prioritise the health service, and it has. This is a budget that will make it easier for people to get appointments with their GP. It will reduce waiting times, and it will ensure people receive the care that they need when they need it. Second, it must support people in the midst of an ongoing cost of living crisis, and it does. A majority of Scots will pay less tax than if they lived in England. A winter fuel allowance has been restored for pensioners in Scotland, extensive childcare support, measures to eradicate child poverty, free prescriptions, more affordable homes, all secured by the budget. And third, it must be a budget designed to attract maximum support, a budget that showed it was possible for parties to work together in Parliament for the benefit of the people of Scotland, and it did. Yesterday's vote demonstrated that partnership and collaboration are possible, and that is something precious, something vitally important in itself. Over the past few months, I've been working to a very simple formula. Hope plus delivery equals trust. Hope, offering a path to greater prosperity, for example, ensuring that we make the most of our vast energy wealth so that an energy-rich Scotland also means energy-rich Scots. More jobs, better paid jobs, tangible benefits, including, above all, lower energy bills for households and businesses. Delivery, getting our public services back on track after a decade of unprecedented knocks. Above all, rebuilding our National Health Service. And trust, because I know that there is a huge amount of anger and frustration with government, with politics, and an overwhelming desire for living standards to improve. Trust in governments, all governments, is at record lows. Poll numbers tell the story, but I hear it time and again in the conversations I have in all parts of the country. We've lived through some of the toughest years that any of us can remember. Standards of living have been squeezed. There is less money in people's pockets at the end of each month. It's no wonder that we are angry. No wonder we want living standards to improve. At the start of the year, I warned that failure to pass the budget would send a signal that Parliament and politics could not deliver, that failure would only serve the interests of an increasingly extreme far right and leave devolution dangerously exposed. But the budget has passed, and a different story can be told. Our politics, our Parliament, have demonstrated that they work. Storm clouds are gathering, we can all see them. The threat from the far right is real. But that leaves me all the more convinced that working together is not only the right choice, but the only choice. That's why I want to share with you a new initiative to bring Scotland together in common cause. More unites us than divides us. That is often said. Now is the moment to make that real. By uniting behind shared values, shared standards of behaviour and shared political norms, and unite against the rise of the far right. We must all step up. And as First Minister, I will do exactly that. My role begins by bringing people together. So I want to set out details of an initiative that will begin by bringing representatives from civic society, from our churches, our trade unions, from our charities together with the leaders of Scotland's parliamentary parties. This gathering, to be held at the end of April, 1 year before the next Scottish election, is a chance to work together for decency, democracy and respect. I will extend an invitation to leaders from all the parliamentary parties and wider civic society to join me in this critical endeavour. I want us to work together to agree a common approach to asserting the values of our country, to bringing people together and creating a cohesive society where everyone feels at home. These are pivotal moments for our country and for our future. If we are to build trust in our politics, we must deliver public services that work better for the people that we serve, and the budget enables us to do so. But we must do more. It is time to come together to draw a line in the sand, to set out who we are and what we believe in, because a politics of fear is a politics of despair. It is a politics that will divide us and destroy so much of what we hold dear. I want us to be ready for whatever this age of uncertainty throws at us, for us to be united in the face of the undoubted challenges that lie ahead. It is a mobilisation of mainstream Scotland that delivered our Parliament a quarter of a century ago. And I have no doubt it is by mobilising mainstream Scotland that we can protect those things that we care about the most, those things that are most important to all of us today. So thank you very much, and we'll now move on to some questions, and we'll just work through the list that we've got here, and I'll come first of all to Colin Mackay. Colin.
A question on what you're saying just now. Are you talking about reform, the rise of reform, who are taking votes from all parties in council by-elections across the country? And when you talk about the politics of fear and despair, they're talking about the politics of frustration. But secondly, are you concerned at what the Prime Minister is doing about cutting international development spending to invest in defence spending, and what that could mean, for example, for jobs in East Kilbride?
On the first part of your question, Colin, I am very concerned about the rise of far-right politics. And I want to use my office as First Minister to work with other parliamentary parties
Does that mean reform?
Pardon?
Does that mean reform?
Yes, of course it does. Yes, of course it does, Colin. And I want to work with other political parties to set out clearly and boldly to the public what we can agree on as the norms and the values of our society, and how we can protect those, because I think they are under threat. I think they're under very, very vigorous threat from the politics of Farage. And I think there are clearly differences of opinion between myself and other political parties. Of course there are. But there is an overwhelming underpinning of common ground about the values that we hold dear, about our politics and our society. So I want to give the leadership to bring people in Scotland together, not just in a parliamentary sense, but in a civic sense, to make our presence felt in protecting the values of our country. And then in relation to your point about the Prime Minister's decision, I understand the Prime Minister's, the importance the Prime Minister attaches to increasing expenditure to ensure that we can deal with the threats that we face as a society. And but I think the choices that have been made about slashing international aid are the wrong choices. I think they are short-sighted, because I think if we go back to the foundations of the principles of international aid, the principles of international aid are about trying to address some of the fundamental issues about inequality within our world, which if we don't address them through international development aid, these issues will come back to be a challenge and a difficulty for us. And that's exactly why I think the choices been made are their own choices about where the money is coming from. I'll come to Lindsay Buse now from the BBC. Lindsay.
Thank you, First Minister. Are you suggesting that the tens of thousands of Scottish people who voted for Reform UK in the general election and may be considering voting for Reform UK in the next Scottish election could be characterised as being far right? And secondly, just to follow up on the aid question, the cut to the aid budget, are you concerned that other areas of public spending could be squeezed to pay for that increase in defence spending, as was suggested could be the case by the IFS?
On your first point, Lindsay, I said in my comments that I accept and understand that people are angry. I don't in any way try to say that, that there isn't anger in our society. I think what worries me is that some of the response to that anger is to find attractiveness in the politics of Farage and the far right. And I think that's the wrong choice. And I'm simply making the point today that it's important that those of us who are repulsed by the politics of Farage and the far right come together to give the leadership and stress the importance of the values that we hold dear about our society, and to essentially create a political culture or reinforce a political culture about the fundamental importance of democratic, civic and inclusive values which are at the heart of the Scotland we live in today, and which has been hard won over many, many years of collaboration involving many of the political parties that I have cited. So I think there's an opportunity for us to give vent to an alternative to the far right and to address the anger that people feel in our society. And I accept that responsibility on me as First Minister in leading the Scottish Government, that I've got to address that by the practical measures that I bring forward as First Minister, and to deliver on people's expectations. So that's the first point. On the second point, I think obviously we're in an incredibly challenging position on public expenditure, and we have just passed a budget in which we have faced up to some of those hard choices, and I know the United Kingdom Government is doing exactly the same. But I think we've got to be very careful about those choices for all the reasons that I set out to call on. That international development aid is an investment in a more peaceful world. It is an investment in tackling inequality in the world, which can fuel the very same anger that I've talked about that exists in some parts of Scottish society today. So I think we have to recognise that challenge and address it. But I am worried that there may be further public expenditure implications that might have an effect on the spending review, which is being addressed by the United Kingdom Government as we speak. We expect that to be concluded towards the summer, and obviously the spending review will be significantly influenced, I would imagine, by some of the comments the Prime Minister made yesterday. Can I now come to Matty Sutton from ITV Border? Matty.
Thank you, First Minister. You've said people have lived through tough times and there's less money. In Dumfries and Galloway, Council tomorrow, they're expected to raise council tax by up to 9%. The Borders have already gone up by 10%. Do you accept that's adding pressure to people and, you know, making them angry as well? And just on the defence increases, do you agree ultimately with the Prime Minister's decision to raise defence spending, and are you worried about security given the geopolitical situation at the moment?
On your first point, Matty, on the council tax, the government, I'm obviously concerned by significant council tax increases. I responded to a question from one of your colleagues during the course of the last few weeks where I said that, I think it was Alistair Grant actually, where I said that I thought single-digit council tax increases were what we should anticipate or expect. So obviously, you know, if they're higher than that, then I'm concerned about those increases. The government has done its bit. Local government asked us for a real terms increase in the core local government settlement, and we gave that. We've increased local authority funding by £1 billion. But I do acknowledge that there are real challenges in the delivery of public services. I've had to respond to that by the investment we're making in a variety of public services, whether that's the health service or in relation to the funding for local government or other public services. So there are challenges because of inflation and other factors. One of the issues which I think is fueling the council tax increases is the implications of employers' national insurance contribution increases. And I think if you look at the kind of calculation of the impact of that, I think it would be reasonable to say that probably 3 to 4% of council tax increases are a product of the employer's national insurance contribution increases. And even then, I'm not sure that will mitigate all of the impact of those of the employer's national insurance contribution increases, because that will then have, there'll be effects on, let's for example say, social care providers who are not getting compensation for the increase in costs. So I think all of these things come together to fuel the increases that are being experienced. On your second point in relation to defence expenditure, I do think it is necessary to take seriously the threat of security, which therefore leads to the conclusion that we need to spend more on defence. I think there are obviously choices to be made. The United Kingdom is spending billions of pounds every year on servicing the Trident nuclear missile system. As a party, as a government, I don't support, as an individual, I don't support the possession of nuclear weapons. There's obviously resources that could be spent alternatively on defence than being spent on Trident missiles, which are not actually stopping conflict in the world today, and they're not able to be deployed in the current challenges that we face. So I think there's a lot of issues that we have to wrestle with as part of the discussion about defence. But fundamentally, on your core point, am I concerned about security? Do I believe we need to be take a stronger position in relation to our security? Yes, I do, because of the threats that we face. Okay, David Wallace-Lockhart from BBC Network. David.
Thank you, First Minister. On your first general point in your speech about the threat of the far right, just for anyone who perhaps might be attracted by the message of reform in Scotland, could you spell out to them what exactly you think makes this party far right? And secondly, is the SNP traditionally has been a party that doesn't champion the idea of spending more on our military, spending more on defence. What is it about the current situation Europe faces that has led you to, as leader of the SNP, be saying it's time to spend more on defence?
I think there's actually a link between the 2 points that you've put to me, David. One is the fact, and I think it's inherent in the nature of the threat that we face to our security. There is a very live and active threat to our security from the aggression of Russia. And I think Farage is, an accomplice to the Russian agenda, an apologist for the Russian agenda. So, to anybody who in this country who thinks that Farage represents a means of protecting this country from the external threats that we face, I would say have a good close look at what Farage has been connected with and what his MPs are saying about the Russian threat and their trivialisation of the Russian threat. So that is why I come to the conclusions that I come to, that we face a very real threat, that if we don't get it right by protecting Ukraine, by protecting the territorial integrity and independence and freedom of Ukraine, then I think we will rue the day. So that's why we have to take that position, and that's why I would say to people in Scotland, that's one of the reasons I would say to people in Scotland who might be attracted by the simplicity of the Farage message, that they should look very, very closely at the small print of what that involves. And the other thing I would say is that it is crystal clear. Farage has been for years leading the argument which has been hostile to migration, and I think that it's based on a fundamentally racist view of the world. I reject that. I think migration is an advantage for Scotland. We have a reducing working age population. We need to attract more working age people to come to live and to work and to contribute in our country, and that's an economic necessity for us, and the Farages would essentially rail against that and undertake significant damage to our society if they were able to prevail. So it's for those reasons I take that view, David. I'll now come to Gina Davidson. Gina.
Thank you, First Minister. Can I ask, the anger and frustration you talk about that is being felt by voters, your party's been in power in Scotland for 18 years. How much responsibility do you feel that you need to take for that situation? And can I also ask, there's a vote in Parliament from the Scottish Greens asking for all
government funding to armed companies in Scotland to end. Now, they're talking about Gaza, but will your party support that today or not?
On that point, obviously there's a government amendment that's being put forward. We'll see what the Parliament's obviously got to debate that this afternoon, but we obviously we do not enable Scottish enterprise, who are the sort of focal point of the point in the Green Motion today. We do not allow Scottish enterprise to fund the manufacture of munitions, and there's an extensive due diligence undertaken by Scottish enterprise about any economic development funding that is made available to any company involved in any form of defence activity. So those checks and those stringent processes are applied in all circumstances. And that will obviously be at the heart of the government's proposal that's put to Parliament today. But as we all know, the government does not operate with a majority, so we'll have to wait and see what Parliament makes of the different proposals that it has in front of it this afternoon. On your first point, Gina, I accept. I'm standing here accepting that we've been in office for a long time. I've been very influential in government activity. I now have the enormous privilege of being First Minister. And I recognise that there is anger in our society. People's living standards have been under acute pressure. It's been a really tough time for people. The combination of austerity, Brexit, the COVID pandemic, the cost of living crisis, the inflation spike, it's been an absolute ongoing perfect storm for years. At the same time, much has been achieved. So, for example, people are getting a much stronger early learning and childcare offer today, despite the effects of austerity. We've got much more infrastructure in our public assets in the country, in our transport infrastructure, in housing, in our education system. We've got data which demonstrates that Scotland alone, as a country within the United Kingdom, is likely to experience a decline in child poverty levels compared to increases in other parts of the United Kingdom. So whilst I understand the anger, and I accept that I've got to address that and to own that, and that's what I'm here to do, it's what I'm about in taking forward my office as First Minister. But also would say to people there are significant achievements that have been made in the face of that climate, that perfect storm of austerity, Brexit, cost of living, inflation spikes, COVID and all that's gone with it, which has put enormous strain on individuals within our society, an enormous strain on households, the length and breadth of the country. I'll come to Neil Pooran now. Neil.
Thanks, First Minister. I was wondering what you think comes next in terms of your push for Scottish independence. When, for example, will the independence prospectus paper series be concluded? And you spoke earlier about bringing different parties and civic society together. Is the fact that you lead a pro-independence party not a bit of a barrier to trying to build that consensus if you're going to have to work with pro-union parties in terms of this initiative to tackle the far right?
I don't think so, Neil, because yesterday demonstrates that we can do that. Yesterday, let me take this opportunity to say something I've said on other occasions, but I'm very happy to say again, I very much welcome the collaborative approach taken by the Liberal Democrats and by the Greens and by Alapa in the budget vote yesterday, in which the government budget passed with 73 votes behind it. And governments, that's an illustration of the fact that we've been able to reach across the constitutional divide within Scottish society to create a focus on delivering for the public in Scotland. In all honesty, I don't really think the Labour Party had a particularly strong argument yesterday about why they weren't supporting the budget, but I'll leave that to them to explain. So I think there's very clear evidence that we can reach across the constitutional issues within Scotland to create unity and cohesion. But the point I'm making, Neil, is a deeper point about the democratic and civic values of our country and who we are and what we are about. And although I may have different opinions about individual policies with other political parties, I accept fundamentally that there's an underpinning of attitude amongst those political parties that I've always encountered, I've always rubbed up against, I've always been able to engage in, which has given me confidence that our society had the advantage of that cohesion underpinning our politics. And I worry about where we might be in the forthcoming period with the presence of Farage, etc., in our politics. So that's why I think it's really important that we do this, regardless of our different opinions on the Constitution. And in relation to the question of independence, I've set out before that I've got to make sure that an argument is made to the people of Scotland about why Scotland would be in a better position if we were an independent country, and why we'd be able to tackle more of the challenges that we face more effectively if we had the powers of independence. That's my job, to make sure I take that forward. That's what we'll be doing in the period going forward. It's what I do all the time, to make sure that people understand there is an alternative to the current arrangements. I'll make the current arrangements work as effectively to the maximum I possibly can do, and I think yesterday's budget is a demonstration of that. But there are other prospects that are available to us, and I want to make that case for independence, and will do so. Right, we'll come on now to the print colleagues, and I'm going to come first of all to Michael Blackley. Michael.
Thank you. Are there circumstances where you would support trans members of staff accessing female-only changing rooms in Scottish Government buildings, in Scottish Government agencies and other parts of the public sector?
Well, all of these questions are carefully calibrated by the requirements of legislation. So in all of the approach to answering that question, Michael, there has to be the law has to be followed, and the law is quite clear that there must be single-sex spaces available within our estate. So that's what the law says and requires of us, and that has to be the case. Now, there are, of course, arrangements in the Equalities Act which address the issues that have to be taken into account by any employer in dealing with any desire from a trans person to use those single-sex spaces, and exemptions that can be deployed if the employer goes through the necessary process of considering the implications of that fact for other members of staff. So I think the key thing here is, and I've made this point on a number of occasions, that the rule of law is the crucial point here, and all organisations must act consistently with the law, and that's what I would expect to be the case in all circumstances. Can I now come to Chris McCall? Chris.
Thank you, First Minister. On the issue of Trident and defence spending, do you believe the UK Government should be diverting funds from the planned replacement for Trident and spending them on more conventional weapons instead? And secondly, given the uncertain security situation that Europe finds itself in, do you believe the SNP's opposition to nuclear weapons remains credible?
I do believe that point, Chris, because as I look at the threats that we face just now, I see nuclear weapons providing no tangible or realistic benefit to the military challenges that we face at this moment and are likely to face in the future. And indeed, I think they are an inhibitor because of the resources that they command. So I think there are other choices to be made, as I said in my earlier answers. There are other choices on defence expenditure to be made, and I think not renewing the Trident nuclear missile system would enable us to make a broader set of choices than we are able to make if we commit to renewing. The UK commits to renewing the Trident nuclear missile system. So there are those choices, and I think the situation we find ourselves in now is such that we need to think very carefully about what the threats are, and there's obviously a strategic defence review underway just now. We need to think about those threats and to consider what is the most effective way to respond to them, and I think investment in conventional weaponry is what we need to do to protect us in these circumstances. I'll go to Libby Brooks. just beside you there. Libby.
Thanks, First Minister. You've talked about the way that the budget shows how partnership and collaboration works across parties and across the constitutional divide. How do you imagine that applying, first of all, in the run-up to the Holyrood elections, in the campaign, how it's conducted next year, and also how that might apply post-results in terms of working with other parties to prevent reform becoming kingmaker?
I think I can't tell you how pleased I am that we were able to attract support from beyond the SNP. One of the things I said to Shona Robertson when we started out on the budget journey several months ago, one of my hopes, what I was directing her to try to achieve, was that we could get other people to vote for the budget. I didn't want the budget to limp through on kind of the neutrality of abstentionism. That wasn't what I wanted. I wanted us to use the budget to try to reshape parliamentary politics. And the fact that we were able to rebuild relationships with the Greens to get to a point of agreement was no mean feat. You were all looking at the situation we faced after the end of the Bute House agreement. Relationships were in a pretty poor state of affairs. We've also managed to reach agreement with the Liberal Democrats who, the speech that preceded my acceptance speech as First Minister in Parliament on the 7th of May last year was from Alec Cole-Hamilton, who said that the votes of the Liberal Democrat members were still available to work with others to bring down the government and force an early election. And here we find ourselves in February 2025 with, thankfully, and with warm gratitude from me, the Liberal Democrats are voting for the budget. Now, how's that come about? Well, I think it's come about because of respectful dialogue. I think it's come about because we as a government have changed our way of working, and we've reached out to people, and we've compromised, and we've found common ground. So I think in a parliament where, currently the government does not have an overall majority, that is an absolute day-by-day necessity. So I think those are the foundations, Libby, of what we've got to do in the run-up to the parliamentary elections in 2026. We've got another budget process to go through in the spring. You conclude one budget process and another one starts kind of pretty soon thereafter. That's going to have to be commenced fairly soon. And we'll be working to build agreement. And of course, everybody's got a vested interest in making sure the budget is in a good place for the start of the 2026-27 financial year, because who knows who'll be having to face the choices of government after the 2026 election. So everyone's got a vested interest in getting to a sensible position. And then you asked me specifically about the locking out of Farage, and that's my basis for doing so. And what I've set out today is the appeal I make to wider Scotland to come together with me, and I'll provide the hosting environment and the courtesy and the respectful debate to bring people together to say we are going to do things in a way that makes sure our country is protected from the bigotry that Farage represents. And I think that will be doing a great service to Scotland if we can bring that about. I'll come to Alistair Grant. Alistair.
Thanks very much, First Minister. Just to follow on from that question, could you see, for example, you've characterised reform as far right. You've talked about the kind of danger posed by Nigel Farage. Could you see some kind of electoral pact with Labour, for example, after the next Holyrood election to lock out reform? I mean, polls suggest they're currently on course for a dozen MSPs, perhaps 15 MSPs. They could be a force to be reckoned with in that next Parliament. Could there be some kind of deal between yourself, Labour, other parties, in order to lock out reform?
I don't favour electoral pacts. What I favour is parties that share the same underpinning and underlying civic values working together to marginalise that far-right sentiment and to address the issues that might well fuel that sentiment. So the budget yesterday, to me, is the key to it. And this is where I regret the fact that we were not able to get the Labour Party into a position of voting for the budget. I think there was no good reason why they couldn't support the budget yesterday. Because what we tried to do, and that's why we were actually able to get the Liberals and the Greens on board, is that we listened with care. Before we formulated a budget, we listened with care to what other parties were saying to us about their priorities. And we constructed a proposition which got into the space that was able to be as broad and as reach as many people as possible. And that resulted in support from the Greens and the Liberals. I think it could very easily have resulted in support from the Labour Party. Indeed, by the time we got to the budget vote yesterday, with the additional provisions on Grangemouth, I would have thought, and given the Prime Minister's announcement at the weekend, I thought that was a pathway for Labour to support it. So I think there's still choices. Of course, there's still choices available to people politically, and there must be, which is why I don't support an electoral pact. But what I do support is agreement around democratic and civic values that will marginalise the forces of the far right, and I think that's our civic duty to do so. Can I come to Conor Matchett, please?
Thank you, First Minister. You've said yourself that you've been in charge and certainly around the Cabinet table since 2007. People and voters looking around today will see the NHS struggling. They'll see, the poverty-related attainment gap failing to shrink and massive council tax hikes. You were also involved, despite the discussions of unity today, in one of the most heavily divisive referendums in Scotland's history. Your critics will say that this is you blaming your own problems on your own bogeyman ahead of the next election, and that the SNP are the problem and not the solution.
I think you've got to look at a number of things in answering that question, Conor. The first is that the SNP won the election in 2007, again in 2011, 2016, 2020, 21. So 4 elections. So the public have been asked this question, and they've given us strong levels of electoral support in the Scottish parliamentary elections, and obviously I'm intent on continuing that performance at the 2026 elections. So fundamentally, the public have not accepted the premise of your question. Second point is that I think when you look at the performance of public services, I think you've got to look at all of the data in the round. So I accept people are waiting too long for treatment. I think it's a product of the disruption of COVID. But the data that's emerging now is indicating that we are making headway on reducing those waiting times. And the proceeds of the additional funding that the government made available last year is seeing health boards exceeding by 41% the diagnostic procedures targets that were set in that funding arrangement. We're seeing an increase in procedures between October 2023 and 2024 of 9.5%. The Prime Minister was commenting on a 7.6% increase in activity in England, which he's right to say it's an improvement in performance, but it was on a baseline which involved a period of strike action. We've increased by 9.5% with no strikes. So we're beginning to make headway on that improvement in the health service. And then on the question of attainment, the data yesterday for S4 pupils contains some very difficult issues, and I accept that. Those are young people who had their education interrupted by the COVID pandemic. And clearly we've got to support those young people to achieve their potential. But we've got over 95% of young people, 95.7% of young people leaving school going into positive destinations. And the attainment gap has reduced by 60% since 2009-10. So individual years, there may well be individual problems. When I look at the latest data on primary and secondary school levels of the attainment gap, we've got in primary the attainment gap at the lowest level ever, and in secondary the lowest ever level in literacy and in numeracy as well. So there's progress being made there. But I accept that there is more to be done, and I'm here to provide the necessary focus and leadership to enable that to be achieved as a consequence. Right, Louise Wilson. Louise from Holyrood.
Good morning, First Minister. You'll be aware, of course, that Keir Starmer is heading over to the US today to meet with President Trump. So given what you've said today about the far right, what is the message that the Prime Minister should be taking to the White House?
Well, the Prime Minister needs to, I think, and actually, the Prime Minister will formulate his own advice. I'm not sure he'll be quite waiting for my contribution to that discussion, but I'll offer it nonetheless. I think the Prime Minister needs to be clear about some real fundamentals that we face a significant security threat from Russia, and that needs to be conveyed. And I think the events of the last few days have left an awful lot of us very unsettled by the position the United States is taking on that very significant strategic global issue. And that needs to be addressed. We have to recognise the reality and the truthfulness of what we face. And what we face, as I marked on Monday, is the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we just cannot have a situation where countries can decide to walk into other countries and to cause the suffering that has been caused. So I hope the Prime Minister takes a message of that type in his dialogue in the United States. Can I come to Simon Johnson, please, Simon?
Thank you, First Minister. Just following up on Michael's question, the guidance for Scottish Government staff states, quote, trans staff should choose to use the facilities they feel most comfortable with. There's no requirement for them to have changed their legal gender or to have undergone gender reassignment. I just wonder if you support that policy, that Scottish Government policy. And just for the sake of clarity, given all the debate about this that's going on at the moment, is it your position that trans women are women?
Well, I've said, the answer I've given to that before is that that I accept that to be the case. And in relation to your first point, of course I support the guidance that's available, but it's underpinned also by the need to ensure that any such question does not come at the disadvantage of other members of staff. And that's a crucial obligation, which is in law, which the government as an employer has got to make sure is provided for within our estate in those circumstances. Can I come to Andrew Lermouth? Andrew.
Thanks, Mr. Minister. Just following on from Simon's question there, when it comes to single-sex facilities, are you confident that Scottish Government and other public bodies have complied with all relevant legislation, not just the Equality Act, that you've not gone beyond the law? And secondly, on reform, they've got no MSPs, only a handful of councillors, no leadership in Scotland. Are you not at risk of overplaying the threat of reform here and even possibly giving them a bit of an electoral boost by sort of, they can now come to this election going, it's mainstream Scotland versus us?
I think on your first point, obviously all legal provisions, wherever they've been enacted, have got to be followed by public bodies, and it's a fundamental point on the rule of law, which you've heard me talking about that on many occasions. In relation to Farage and reform, I think this needs to be called out. I think there needs to be a reaction from mainstream Scotland, and I think if you look, and what I'm encouraging is a response which begins to address, I think, some of the sentiment that comes out of the German election results and which come out of others, that you have to address the fundamental underlying issues that make organisations like Farage's party attractive to people. So I'm accepting that responsibility as First Minister, and I'm trying to, my agenda is very, very much focused on the priorities and the interests of people in Scotland and their public concerns, and I'm focused very much on those. And the budget, the programme for government does that, the budget is aligned with that into the bargain. But I'm taking a further step beyond that and trying to encourage Scotland as a country to celebrate what we value, to celebrate and to mark and to protect what we value, what binds us together as a society, and to do as much as we can to use that as a tool of avoiding the presence of Farage and his associates within Parliament. Let me come now to James Walker to the National. James.
Thank you, First Minister. I want to ask a question on the Scottish Enterprise funding for arms firms. I understand the Scottish Government position that funding isn't going directly to munitions, but at the end of the day, it still contributes to their balance sheets at the end of the financial year. Firms like Base Systems, which amid the slaughter of tens of thousands of men, women and children in Gaza, as well as thousands in Ukraine and across the world, made a record £3 billion in profit last year. Can you explain why the Scottish Government should be giving these firms millions in public money? I don't think they need it. And how would you make the moral argument in doing so too?
The moral argument is that we apply the very strongest level of scrutiny through the due diligence process that means that no public funding can be used to support the manufacture of munitions. So that's that core point. And the second point is that we have to make sure that there is we're obliged by the legal framework in which we operate about the basis of decision-making about industrial development grant support, that we've got to have a legal basis for making a judgment about any distribution of those grant payments. And that's what makes it difficult to take the type of stance that is being asked of us in some of the parliamentary debate, because we would have to have a legal basis for taking that position, and I don't think the legal basis exists for us to do that, given the legislative requirements that we are obliged to follow in taking decisions about public expenditure. Can I come to John Boothman?
John, you said that Nigel Farage represented a live threat. He trivialised the threat of Russia, and he had a fundamentally racist view of the world. Do you think those attitudes apply to his great friend Donald Trump, who many think is, close to the far right? And secondly, are you worried in terms of the initiative that you're actually taking, that other parties in Scotland, Russell Finlay, people have said has been aping reform, and Ash Sarwar didn't completely close the door to dealings with individual reform MPs or MSPs or any ideas they might have? Is that something that concerns you and might stop them cooperating in any initiative you've got?
I think on the first point, John, it's quite clear that President Trump has a very different view of the world to the one that I have. So there are differences there between us quite clearly, and I have to acknowledge those. I've also rehearsed before that I feel I have an obligation as First Minister, that I'm the leader of the Scottish Government. If there is an engagement to be made with the President of the United States, I think people would expect me to do so. But I think in that context, there also has to be an acknowledgement and acceptance that there were very different views of the world held by myself and President Trump, and I hold those views passionately and will, of course, express them. In relation to your second point, John, I think there's this is a moment that I think we've reached where I think some of the threats to some of the values that have underpinned so much, actually the entirety of my life, are now feeling less certain. And as First Minister, I wouldn't be able to look myself in the mirror if I didn't do something to try to protect those. And that's exactly what I'm doing today. And I invite other political parties and parliamentary parties in the spirit in which I've expressed myself today, which I hope has come across as respectful and courteous to others, recognising difference on policy questions, but respect for the fact that fundamentally we share the same democratic and civic values, and I want to try to make the most of that in protecting the values that have underpinned all of my political life in Scotland. And I think that's a moment where I've got to rise to that challenge as First Minister and invite others to work with me on that basis. The final question will be from David Walker, Daily Express. David.
Hi, First Minister. This is your 5th speech of the year or press conference, and you've barely mentioned independence. Have you given up on it? Are you going to be the First Minister who succeeds in breaking up the UK? And second question, there's 12 SNP MSPs who are retiring or quitting at the next election. Are they abandoning a sinking ship?
So, you know me well. I've been around for a while. I am absolutely committed to Scottish independence. I've believed in the merits of Scottish independence all of my adult life since I was a teenager, and I am determined to do everything I can to ensure that Scotland becomes an independent country. So in answer to your first question, no. I obviously have to acknowledge that if you want to win an argument, persuade people about the merits of independence, you've got to be able to get a hearing from the public. What I'm doing just now is making sure that I can get a hearing by delivering on the expectations of the public and addressing the realities of the situation that they face. Now, if you go back, some of you will remember, because some of you were there, the press conference I gave on the morning after the 2024 general election, which was a very challenging morning because of the electoral setback that we had faced. But one of the points I made there was that people would only be persuaded by the merits of independence if they saw independence as a solution to the challenges they face in their daily lives. My starting point for making progress on that question is to address the challenges that people face in their daily lives, and that's what I'm doing as First Minister. Now, in relation to your point about members of the Scottish Parliament, colleagues will make judgments. Some colleagues have served for a long time. Some are wanting to do other things in their lives. Some people's lives have changed and they're deciding to do other things. And we just have to respect the fact that this is quite a challenging experience being a politician these days. So I suspect some people are maybe feeling that and wanting to perhaps not volunteer for the degree of stress that I have volunteered for in all of this. So people will make their choices. And then I suppose my final point, David, is to reflect on where we find ourselves today. When I became First Minister, not many people gave us much prospect that we'd be able to get a budget through Parliament. Not many people gave us much prospect that we could return to leadership in the opinion polls after the significant setback of July 2024. And today I find myself standing in front of you all, openly answering your questions, willingly and enthusiastically. Willingly and enthusiastically, happily and cheerfully, as a First Minister who doesn't command a majority in Parliament, who's just got a budget through Parliament, and who's leading in the opinion polls by a country mile. So I think things are moving in the right direction. Let me just put it like that, and we'll keep building on that. Now, I've allowed you all to get questions. Is there anyone got anything absolutely burning that they want to ask me again? Gina?
Sorry, can I just ask, following up Chris's question about nuclear weapons, Ukraine gave up their nuclear arsenal and have been invaded. People would draw a line between those two actions. I mean, does it make sense for the UK to give up its nuclear arsenal?
I think the whole question is about security guarantees on that question, Gina, because Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons and it engaged in, but it's not had all the security guarantees that I think are necessary in the world today. And therefore, that, to me, that's the answer to the point, is to have the necessary security guarantees that will protect a country like Ukraine. And I think we've also got to be, and this is where I come to the point about, well, what are we dealing with in Russia? Russia's signed up to all sorts of agreements that they have just ignored, dumped, done the absolute opposite of. So there needs to be realistic and substantial security guarantees in place. Right, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you.